and welcome to the first of these little videos that are going to accompany my textbook, Discovering Statistics. I'm Andy Field. If you're from outside of England, then I have a funny accent. And if you're from inside of England, I probably also still have a funny accent. But what I'm going to try to do, despite the funny accent, is to guide you through a few things in the book. So these are going to be kind of on-screen videos that show you how to do various bits and bobs, and hopefully somewhere along the line I'll be able to show you some other tips and give you bits of advice that are not in the book, which will hopefully make it worth watching these films, which, let's face it, are going to be pretty tedious. So when you load up SPSS, this is what you get on your screen, and initially it will ask you whether you want to open a file, which is what happens if you click that thing, or you can type in some data. Now in chapter 3 we have a look at typing in data and what kind of variables you can set up in SPSS. So what I'm going to do now is kind of guide you through that. So first of all, assuming you've loaded up SPSS and you're thinking, well, I've got some new data, I want to type it in, and obviously I'm really excited about it, well, you'd click on that. So you want to type in some data, then you click on OK. So we get this thing called the data editor, and it's basically a big spreadsheet which you know, is a series of columns, series of rows. And the way data is laid out in SPSS typically is we put variables in different columns, so these things here, and we put cases of data in different rows like that. So when we set up a new variable, we generally set it up in a new column. So we'll have a look at setting up one of the data files in the book chapter, and well, we'll start off setting up what's known as a string variable. And a string variable is basically a variable where you want to type letters. So for example, if you run an experiment, you might have a participant code that you've assigned to each of your people. Now in the example in the book, I've actually used names. So if you wanted to put people's names, because they're strings of text, you have to set up what's known as a string variable. Now you see down here, we've got what's known as a data view. So that's basically where you put your data, and also a variable view. And the variable view is used to set up new variables. So if we want to set up a new variable, we don't want to do it in the data view, we want to do it in the variable view. Now you can see along the top here, there's lots of attributes that you can assign to a variable. So first of all, you can give it a name. Now if we want to, well, as I said, our first variable is going to be the names of people, so we could call that variable name. Then it asks us what type of variable we want, and if you click on here, it gives you lots and lots of choices. Now by default it will set up a numeric variable, which is a variable that involves numbers. If you want to do text, you need to change it to a string variable, and you can decide how many characters you want. So the default's 8, but you know, maybe you know, you've got someone with a very long name, so you want to change it to 20. Okay, that's basically, the variable is set up already. So we've set its width. Decimal places don't really matter because it's a string variable. One thing that is pretty important is you can give your variables labels, and this is a habit that I try to get people into because it's quite handy. As you do more and more research, you get more and more data files, and if you're anything like me, your memory gets sucked out of your head by aliens, so you can't remember anything. And then when you go back to a data file 6 months after you were originally working on it, you've got some variable, you know, called, you know, TXY47Z, and you've got no idea what that stands for. So labels are a really good idea. It just allows you to, for example, put in a descriptive title. So okay, in this example, name, it's pretty self-evident that it's going to be the participant's name, but even so, you know, never underestimate how much your brain will atrophy between you setting up your data file and you actually analyzing your data. So you know, off you go, put a label in, otherwise I'll come round and beat you around the head with a big stick. Values, that's only relevant if you've got some kind of numeric variable. We'll come on to that later. And things like alignment, this just determines whether you know, basically the text or numbers are centered or aligned to the left or aligned to the right. So that's really down to your personal preference. The other thing that's quite important when setting up a variable is this thing in the measures column. And basically you can set up a variable to be either a nominal variable, an ordinal variable, or a scale variable. Now to find out what those are, read the book. But it is quite important to set these. Now if you have a string variable, it should always be a nominal variable because it represents names. It's not anything involving numbers. So we can leave that as nominal. Now in our data view, which we've switched back to, we can now enter some names. So you'll see in the book, first participant was called Leo, second one Martin, third one Andy, fourth one Paul, and so on and so on. I'm not going to enter it all now because that will make this film even more tedious than it already is. So there's our first variable. Woohoo! How good is that? Not very, admittedly, but there you go. Now we might also want to know, when were these people born? Are they youthful spring chickens, or are they old gits? Well, we can do this by creating another variable where we put their birth dates. So again, sorry, I'm going to be very good in these films, just switching between things without explaining what I'm doing. So go to the variable view, and we want to start up a name. So we could call it DOB for date of birth, for example. Now, for the type of variable, with dates and stuff, although they're kind of numbers in a way, we can set them up as a date variable. And you'll see here that once you do that, it gives you various options as to how you want your dates to come out. Now, this is going to, Americans, for example, set up their dates very different from English people. So this just gives you the choice of how you want to do it. So in the UK, we typically do days, months, and then years, whereas in the US they tend to do months, days, and then years. So I'm going to set it up, I think, like that. So I'm going to have 2 numbers for the days, and then 3 letters representing the months, and then I'm going to do the full the full years with 4 numbers. So in label, because date of birth, it could stand for donkey on beach, and in 6 months' time, that's exactly what I might think it stands for. I'm going to write myself a little note here to remind myself that it stands for date of birth. And in fact, if I wanted to be really, really precise, I could say participant's date of birth, because it could be the date of birth of the Prime Minister or President. Again, we don't need to really worry about anything else. Then in our data view, we can start entering some dates of birth. So the first one was 17th of Feb 1997, and second one 24th May 1969, and then my one is 21st June 1973, which does make me quite old. Okay, the third type of variable that we're going to set up is what's known as a coding variable. And this is a variable where we use numbers to represent groups. Now in the data file that we're looking at the moment, we have a variable known as job, which is basically to specify whether someone was a lecturer or a student. Now you might think, well, we could set this up as a string variable. We could just type in lecturer for the lecturers and type in student for the students. But in terms of analysing the data, that's not very useful. So what we do instead is we assign numbers to represent different groups. So for example, we could say when there's a lecturer, then we'll give it the number 1, and when it's a student, we'll give it the number 2. So to set up this variable, again, we go back to the variable view, give it a name, job, that creates the variable. Type, now this is going to be a numeric variable because it involves numbers, and we can change the decimals to 0 actually, because the numbers are not going to have any sort of precision other than just being whole numbers, like 1 meaning lecturer, so we don't really need any decimal places. Little description here, job of participant, and now this values thing, this is where this comes into play. So when you're using numbers to represent groups, we can click on this thing that I'm about to click on, and it brings up the value labels dialog box. And in here we can assign different numeric values, for example 1, a label. So 1 means lecturer. So once we've done that, we can click on add, and now SPSS has stored this information. And you can check your spelling as well, which is, if you're as bad at spelling as I am, that's quite a useful feature. And we'll say, well, we'll assign the number 2 to be the category of students. And again, we need to add that. If we forget to add it, then SPSS won't remember it. And we can click on OK. So now this box has been filled with information that tells SPSS that when it sees a 1, that's a lecturer, and when it sees a 2, it's a student. Now the other thing we need to bear in mind here is to set the measurement scale of this variable. Now SPSS, whenever it has a numeric variable, it assumes that it's like a continuous variable, a scale variable. However, in this case, we don't have that. We have a variable that represents categories of people. So we need to change this to nominal. Again, you can read the book for a bit more detail about what these types of variables are. But essentially, we can now enter the data. Now, all of these are lecturers, so we can put in 1 to represent the fact that they're lecturers. And well, I'll enter a bit more data here so we can get on to our students. So we had Graham, Karina. In fact, while I do this, I'm just going to pause you for a moment. Okay, by the wonders of modern technology, the data's miraculously got filled in. So we're back with our job variable, and up to this point, all of our participants are lecturers, but as we move on from Graham to Karina, Karina's a student, Karina number 2 is a student, and Doug, Mark and Mark are students. So we've entered numbers to represent which groups they belong to. Now, because we've told SPSS what these numbers represent, we can use this button up here to toggle between the labels, lecturer and student, and the numbers that we've put in. So, it depends which way you prefer to look at your data, really. I prefer to look at it like that. I prefer words to numbers. Okay, now finally, we're not going to enter all the data from this example because otherwise you'd have nothing to do for yourself. But we will have a look at entering one of the other variables, which was the number of friends that these people have. So again, to enter this variable, go to the variable view. We'll call it friends. Again, it's going to be a numeric variable. Again, we don't really need decimal places here because hopefully people only have whole numbers of friends and not parts of friends, although you can never tell with a university lecturer. Give it a label, number of friends. Values, we don't need values here because these are actually going to be numbers representing something in real life, not groups of people. It's actually like a continuous variable. And so we can leave this all pretty much as it is. It's going to be a scale variable as well. It's not representing categories of people. And then we can type our data in. So our first person had 5 friends, then 2, then 0, 4, and so on. 156. Yeah, that's entirely possible, I'm sure. And there you go. You've just entered your first, well, I've just entered my first set of data. So what we're going to have a look at in the next video is some of the other windows in SPSS. So there's a file that's going to have a look at the syntax window, another file that's going to have a look at the output window. Just before we go, I'll run you through some of the menus on the data editor window. They're, well, to be honest, they're all quite self-explanatory, really. So in your file menu, you can do things like open up a new data file or a new syntax window or a new output file. You can open files, and again, for some reason, it categorizes them into different types. You can save your file. You can print your data if you want to. Also down here, you can this allows you to quickly access files that you've recently worked on the same computer. So recently used data files or recently used other files, either SPSS syntax files or output files. The edit menu, you can do things like, well, it's got your undo and your redo, which you find in a lot of software, which can be quite useful, and your copy and paste and all that malarkey that you're probably quite used to using. You can insert variables, and you'll notice there's also an icon on the toolbar here to do the same thing. You can insert cases as well, and again there's those two icons there. So if you're up here, you can insert a variable like that should you wish to, and you can also delete it by right clicking and then clicking on clear. Same if you want to add a case. If you select the row and go to insert case, you get a new row appearing. Again, if you right click there with the mouse, then you can clear that. Also with the you can find numbers. If you've got a big data file, it can be quite useful to go and try to find a number. So if you click on, so if we try and find Paul, hey, there it goes. It finds it for us. Fantastic. Options, that's also quite useful. If you click on options, you get an options window up, and you can do, well, you can set all sorts of options. Some of them are more useful than others. So for example, in your SPSS output window, which we haven't really looked at yet, you can set various things like the fonts. I mean, they're all, personally I don't really change any of these, but if you particularly like a certain kind of font, then this is the place to change it. I mean, one of the things that is quite useful in here, this is something that's actually mentioned in the book, is if you go to file locations, you can specify where SPSS goes to look for data files, and by default it just goes to your documents folder. But I normally set this up to look. I have a specific folder where I store all my data, and you can change these to make sure that SPSS always goes to the folder where you keep all your data files, and that can kind of speed things up a bit. The other thing worth knowing about down here is that SPSS actually records everything you do in what's known as a journal file. So basically any analysis that you do on a particular computer, it saves all the commands. So all the analysis you do gets saved in this little text file called a journal file, which means that should you ever need to rerun a load of analyses that you've already done before, then you can do it really quickly by finding this file, and this file will contain all the SPSS syntax commands that you've pretty much ever done on this computer. So you could, in theory, like rerun every analysis you've ever done in like more or less a press of a button. So well, I have known people who've been in situations where they've had to reanalyze a big data set because maybe some of the data was wrong or something like that, and they thought, oh my god, it's going to take me 15 years to do that. And you just point them towards this file here, and you can access all the syntax files, or sorry, all the syntax commands, and just rerun them, which is very good. Okay, in the other menus, well, the data menu, we'll come on to some of these things. Well, certainly a lot of them are mentioned in the book, but we'll probably also go through them in some of the films. There's, well, things like sorting your data if you want to do that. Splitting the file is something that we go through in the book, and there's going to be a video on selecting cases as well. So basically everything in here is to do with like manipulating your data. If you want to restructure it or mess around with it, then it will be in here. Transform menu is useful for computing new variables. Again, there'll be a video on that later on, and we can also recode variables should we want to, and things like that. The analyze menu is the main menu that we look at in the book, and that's where all your basically all the data analysis stuff that you want to do can be found in this menu. And well, we're going to go through lots of these things, so I'm not really going to talk about it because it's quite boring. But that's where you find all your analysis stuff. Now, one thing that is worth noting is there are certain bits of analysis or certain procedures are only available if you've paid for specific kind of package components. So if you have like a basic SPSS, there'll be things in this menu that you won't see on your screen. So just to let you know, the reason for that is SPSS want more of your money before they'll let you do certain things. Graphs we'll have a look at, but obviously the graphs menu is where you use the chart builder and stuff like that. And you can also buy various add-ons for SPSS. I don't personally have any of them, but there are certain applications like Amos if you want to do structural equation modeling, things like that. But we don't really look at any of those in the book. The other really useful thing, and well, actually it varies in its usefulness to be perfectly honest, but there's a help menu. And often you can sort out a lot of problems that you may encounter by clicking on the help menu. And it's arranged by topics. So, you know, I mean, it's just a standard Windows or Mac, if you happen to be using a Mac, kind of help thing. So you can search for help if you want to know how to do a t-test or something. Do a search for t-test and it will list all the topics related to t-tests. So there's a lot of stuff, but say here, this is going to be, I hope, the independent samples t-test. Click on that, tells you a bit about it, kind of what it tells you about data considerations, tells you how to obtain one, so it'll take you through the menus and everything. So in effect, my book is completely redundant, because if you just use the help files, you can pretty much find out how to do anything you might want to do. So, and that is really useful, because there are certain, I use the help files all the time, because quite often I'll be doing things and there'll be some little option I have absolutely no idea what it means at all and whether I should tick it or not. And so normally then I'll do a little search on the help file and it will invariably come up with some highly complicated thing that I don't understand, and then I just don't tick it anyway. But you know, in other instances it's quite useful. So yeah, use the help files. They're you know, they can get you out of trouble. And there you go. Okay, that's it for this video, and I'll be back.